Welcome back to Puzzles Week. This is game mechanics and puzzles, and a little bit of challenge and difficulty towards the end here. So, when we think about game mechanics, I'm going to assume in this case you're not building heterogeneous puzzles, but as long as we're on the same level there, we'll be fine. So in general, if you're building procedural or combinatorial puzzles, in general, the core mechanics of your game will be what allows the player to actually interact with your puzzles. And with this in mind, what you want to do is kind of make sure that at least in the beginning you're limiting the number of mechanics that you're using in each puzzle. Focus instead on the level design aspects that will help the player lead to the solution. Focus on using your mechanics in interesting ways, and focus on general polish for the puzzle, right? And if you're kind of stuck in this mechanical space and thinking, well, okay, how do I have a really limited number of puzzle-based mechanics that a player can use? You really want to choose flexible mechanics. It's a rule of thumb that I heard. So this is not my advice, and unfortunately I can't remember off the top of my head where it came from. But if you take a given mechanic, try and think of a bunch of different ways to use it, a bunch of different puzzles that would use it. So if you can think of 5 different puzzles that use a given mechanic, chances are you're going to be able to think up a lot more as time goes on after that kind of like initial, oh yeah, okay, cool. If you can't come up with a series of, let's say 5 puzzles with a given mechanic, it probably means that mechanic doesn't have a lot of depth for creating a lot of interesting puzzles. So again, be sure to, again, at the design phase, just think about that and say, okay, well, is this suitable for the kinds of puzzles that I want to do? Yes or no? And that kind of technique or thought process will at least help you make the decision. And of course, in true James fashion, it's on my next slide. So yeah, choose flexible mechanics. You should be able to think of about 5 puzzles using a given mechanic immediately. And if you can't, it might not be suited for deep and interesting puzzles. There you go. The slide said it too. Furthermore, use those mechanics in the maximum number of ways. Fully explore what that mechanic is capable of, or what that mechanic makes your player capable of. And think about the aspects or the consequences of all of those things. And so really, like, as a designer, when we're starting to think about puzzles beyond like the most basic, we really need to have a good feeling. We need to know and understand our game mechanics inside and out. And finally, once player has mastery over whatever mechanics are relevant for your game, start thinking about how they would combine them. So okay, how do you, if we give the player a double jump and a dash, how do we create interesting platforming puzzles using those? If they've got short range teleport and some kind of explosive, how do we create interesting puzzles for that? And this might be something like, it may end up that there's something that even you as a designer didn't think of, and players might end up discovering tricks all on their own, in the playtesting phases. And then it kind of comes back to you and says, okay, is this useful for gameplay? Is this useful for building puzzles? It's up to you to decide. But definitely you want to focus on mechanics that are flexible enough such that you can get a lot of variety about them, a lot of variety from them, rather, because you want players to feel that success. You definitely reuse your mechanics and reuse tricks within your puzzles, and this will help players like understand what you are asking them to do. But don't reuse puzzles themselves. If a player encounters the same puzzle that they've seen before, they already have an understanding of it, and they're like, okay, yeah, I get it. It's kind of boring. So, we talk about using robust mechanics for puzzles, and that's so that we can have a lot of options and flexibility to keep those solutions interesting. You also want to, again, when you're thinking about reusing some of those techniques or those themes, You want to stagger them and put some variety within them so that you end up not having, here it says not boring, but you want to give the player some variety, right? And so, with this in mind, thinking about mechanics and flexibility, it's really, really important. It becomes really important to go back to how you are training your player to understand those mechanics or use those mechanics. Excuse me, and how you train them to understand the kinds of puzzles within your game to begin with. So this is kind of back to last week or back to even farther, where you think about, okay, how do you integrate those kinds of things into level design? How are you tutorializing those aspects? And this is really, really important because you can't simply have a block of text for every single puzzle. You're going to lose so many players if you try that kind of approach. So fall back on kind of what you know already, right? Teach puzzles to your players the same way that you would teach game mechanics. Teach them one element at a time and use kind of that process to scale difficulty and scale variety. What becomes even more important when we're thinking about tutorializing parts of puzzle solving is we need to try and anticipate where our players are going to misunderstand things or fail. If there's a way that you can design your levels or design your introductory puzzles such that you can tell what your player is misunderstanding, you can then provide them hints for how to go on, and you can kind of take that approach. Another thing you can do if you have a really complex method for approaching some element of solving a puzzle, you would want to teach those kind of hard to understand techniques by making those techniques really the only thing that the player can do in a given space. So they have to go through that motion in order to proceed, but make the possibility space, like constrain it such that the player arrives at that conclusion very, very quickly. One thing that will help with this and will help with any kind of puzzle tutorialization is reducing the visual clutter and making sure the stuff that the player is able to see is relevant to the puzzle. Or take the flip side of that approach and say, if you're placing the player in a nondescript room or whatever, make sure that the stuff that the player needs to use in order to solve a puzzle is easy to find or easy to see. And as with everything else in game design, feedback is incredibly important to training your player as well, especially for any actions that require some kind of precision on their part in terms of game interactions or in terms of input. This can be something for if you have a really precise jump in your game that a player needs to traverse, you'll want to make sure that there's some kind of marking on the platforms that indicates that this is like a good spot to jump. And you can see there are examples of that all over the place. Similarly, like if a jump is too far to be made, it should be much too far. In the case here where Super Metroid, not necessarily like a puzzle here, but the platforms on either side are very far apart, enough so that a player wouldn't reasonably think that they would be able to make this with a casual jump, and that they would need some sort of other tool in order to approach this kind of like very, very small environmental puzzle. And there's a lot of ways that you can scale the difficulty of your puzzles, since we're talking about training and challenge. Certainly you want the difficulty of puzzles in your games to go from sort of simple puzzles all the way up to complex puzzles. But there's different patterns that you can use. You can simply have a linear scale where every puzzle is harder than the last one. You can have a more staggered process where puzzles become more difficult, and then maybe after a really hard puzzle you are either switching the mechanics, so you have an easier puzzle with a new mechanic, or after a really difficult puzzle, you give a few easier puzzles so that the player can have a bit of a break. And so that's kind of the same thought process in these two challenge graphs. It's just that this one has a much higher variance, and this one doesn't go back to kind of like very, very easy puzzles. It kind of constantly lowers or constantly raises the floor for how difficult the puzzles would be. Yeah. So, sorry, I'm trying to get rid of the laser pointer here. In terms of like understanding how you want your difficulty to scale, the next step is thinking about, okay, it's really easy, or it's easier in an action sense to control the difficulty of action. How do we control the difficulty of a puzzle? And so there are a lot of things that make a puzzle harder or easier. First is maybe how direct you are with your clues. So you can leave clues near or perhaps not near the puzzle that hint at the solution that the player can find, and you can control, as I said, how direct they are. It can be, press the buttons in this order: red, blue, green. It could be that same idea hidden in like a poem or something, or in code. It's up to you. But another thing that controls or affects how difficult the puzzle is actually how close the puzzle itself is to the solution. So if you have a puzzle and then the solution is, in the next screen or on the same screen, it's a little bit easier to understand. If you have a puzzle where the solution is, 5-10 screens away, it becomes a little bit more difficult because the player might be thinking about other things, losing some information, who knows. Offering a variety of potential solutions would kind of generally make a puzzle easier. If you want to offer multiple pathways to something like that. And then, of course, you can also make puzzles a little bit easier by providing hints for incorrect solutions. You can also make puzzles more difficult by not providing hints for incorrect solutions. So there's a lot of ways that you can kind of scale these things. So thanks, and I will see you in the next one. That's it for mechanics and puzzles and challenge.